wonderful, wonderful session of the Katz Center for Mexican Studies. We have two wonderful scholars today that will be sharing their work with us, and we're just gonna wait for one more minute as more people are joining our session before we get started. Great. We're very pleased to be welcoming two renowned scholars of race and ethnicity, Mónica Moreno Figueroa and also Peter Wade. They'll be sharing their latest collaborative research project with us today on Latin America. And Mónica Moreno Figueroa is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Cambridge. She's also a fellow in social sciences at Downing College, also in Cambridge. She was born and raised in Mexico, and she obtained her PhD in sociology from Goldsmiths College, also at the University of London. Professor Moreno Figueroa's research has primarily developed around three main areas: the lived experience of race and racism, feminist theory and the interconnections between beauty, emotions, and racism, and also visual methodologies and applied research collaborations. And she has focused on Mexico, but also Latin America more broadly. Peter Wade is also joining us today, and he obtained his PhD in social anthropology from Cambridge University as well. There's a Cambridge connection going on here. And in his research, he explores ethnic relations and ideas about race in Colombia. And he has focused primarily around Blackness, around the construction of Blackness, as it relates to race mixture and the construction of racial identity in Colombia. But he also has taken a broader lens in his work, in his highly cited book on race and ethnicity in Latin America. He examines the complex social and historical dynamics that shape Black and indigenous identities throughout Latin America. He has also famously criticized the pretty widespread idea that racists are a minority in Europe and the US, that race is no longer important in those societies. And instead, he believes that global anti-racist movements can actually learn from Latin America. They can learn from societies where racism is typically seen as something that was overcome and where racism has been minimized. So he believes that Latin America offers many lessons to people who care about racial inequality and racial differences. Today, Professor Moreno Figueroa and Professor Wade will share their collaborative project looking at 4 different societies in Latin America. And this project is called Alternative Grammars of Anti-Racism in Latin America. We are very happy to welcome you both. We're gonna, let you take it from here, and we're gonna leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be plenty of that. And with that, having said that, please, I welcome you both to take over the microphone now.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna share the screen now. So, okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the invitation, René, to this to give this talk. And in a way, for us, it's very exciting because it also coincides with the publication of the book that this project sort of came. What resulted, one of the publications that resulted. And we called the talk Alternative Grammars of Anti-Racism, and the book that came out last March, it's called Against Racism, Organizing for Social Change in Latin America. And I'm gonna just tell you very briefly what the project was so that you get a sense of what we're gonna talk about. And also just to say that the project looks at 4 different contexts, Mexico included, And we're going to talk about the 4 contexts because it is a relational project that is a comparative and relational project. But of course, we can concentrate on Mexico for the discussion if you want so. So I just want to first of all say that this was a big project with loads and loads of people involved, with 4 national teams, with national advisors, researchers. And this project, what we're going to present today couldn't be possible without the participation of all these people. So we're using the data that and the analysis that we created collectively. And some of the things were more individual by the researchers. And I just want to show you their faces so you have a sense of who they were and how broad and mixed group of people were together working on this. So we call it La Pora, Latin American Anti-Racism in a Post-Racial Age. We just couldn't find a better acronym. After Perla's project, there's nothing better than that. So everything just, well, Peter has now one called Carla, which is much better than La Pora, but anyway. So basically this project was looking at these 4 countries, doing comparative and relational approach, looking specifically at anti-racist and anti-racist action and discourse. And we look at a variety of cases, some more in depth, other more contextual, looking particularly at Indigenous and Black peoples and concentrating on these big areas of organizing, state institutions, NGOs, social movements, and also some legal cases. And what we're gonna be presenting you sort of draws from this. So I'm gonna now pass on to Pete.
Thank you, Mónica. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. So the context for our study is in what might be called a post-multiculturalist period. So if we look at the 1990s or late 80s into the 90s, this was a period of multiculturalist reform right across Latin America, in which political constitutions were reformed, and a huge raft of legislation took place, recognizing the rights and existence of indigenous peoples and to a less extent Afro-descendant peoples. And this was seen as a big achievement, and indeed it was. But gradually, especially in the 2000s, post-Durban, 2001, the World Conference on Racism, it became clear that there were certain limits, very major limits to multiculturalism and the kinds of rights that were being handed out under these multiculturalist rights regimes. Violence against indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, dislocation, dispossession continued, business as usual in terms of land grabbing and neoliberal development, major projects, mega projects, and so on, continued unabated. And in that context, there was, and also in the context of what Charlie Hale and Juliet Hooker and their team have called the backlash, the racist backlash, where there was a backlash from the right against these kinds of rights, there has been a gradual and incipient turn towards anti-racism, in which the whole idea of racism, and maybe structural racism, and of the need to combat racism as a whole system has gradually become more of a conversation that can be had in the public domain, which is, in Latin America at least, is relatively unusual. So we were looking at this, and we encountered that there were diverse ways of talking, and in some cases not talking, about racism and anti-racism. So first of all, some people, organizations, state organizations, grassroots organizations, social movements, and so on, were explicit in talking about racism, the existence of racism as a system, and so on, and naming it as such. In other cases, we found that there was a much more indirect approach and a reluctance in some cases to actually talk about racism. We also found, I mean, this is fairly familiar, that some people talked about racism as a kind of behavioral issue, a matter of the attitudes and behavior of individual people who might be found morally wanting, or, you know, the bad apple kind of scenario. And in other ways, people talked about racism as a structural thing, a systemic factor. So what we were interested in, the implications of these different ways of talking about racism for anti-racist strategies. Mónica, can I have the next slide, please? And this is significant because it relates to, you know, how best to tackle the whole issue of racialized inequality and racialized injustice. And there are two kind of basics, to simplify a bit, there are two basic approaches here. One sees race and racism as something that is incidental to capitalism and to liberal social orders. You know, these orders are in principle perfectible. They are suffering from sort of anachronistic holdovers of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on, which can gradually be eliminated through policies, etc. The other approach sees race and racism as, in fact, constitutive of capitalism, liberalism, and what can broadly be called modernity, in inverted commas. That is to say that capitalism and liberalism and modernity actually depend on race and racism, as they do on sexism and heterosexism, and you can't have one without the other. So this is an approach that's taken by a wide variety of different theoretical stances: post-colonialism, critical race theory, coloniality and decoloniality, etc. Now, in both these approaches, it seems that the first step, if you want to combat racism, is to actually name it as such. That seems to be implicit in that, in both approaches. But what we were also interested in was the second approach, which is, you know, which is the approach that we take, nevertheless seems to set the bar for action very high. That is to say, if you want to combat race and racism, then you've really got to kind of totally reform capitalism, liberalism, modernity. You have to create a whole new system. And the tendency then is to say that any anti-racist action or strategy that doesn't attempt to do that is a failure. So we were worried by the idea that this sets the bar for action very high and tends to be create a kind of dismissive attitudes towards certain kinds of anti-racist actions and strategies. So we were more interested with working with what Carolyn Pedwell calls an understanding of the imbrication of the revolutionary and the routine, of the habitual and the radical. And we found in Latin America a huge diversity of ways of organizing to combat racism. And we were reluctant to kind of sit in judgment on this diversity, and to say that some strategies and actions were worthwhile and others were not, because they didn't take a radical enough approach, or they weren't talking about structural racism or something. Therefore, they were lower down the scale of value, if you like. So we wanted to take an inclusive approach and to see the good things that could come out of a diversity of anti-racist actions, without nevertheless saying that, you know, anything can go, you know, that any action was equivalent to any other. So we wanted to keep a sense of a kind of radical horizon or vision, which allowed us to take a critical attitude towards a diversity of racial actions without dismissing ones that might be seen by some people as lower down the scale. So particularly, we were interested in the idea that something that didn't necessarily name racism or explicitly say we are anti-racist could also be a useful way of working against racism. So we did find some organizations that were very explicit about racism. This one from Colombia, called Chao Racismo, for example, puts obviously racism at the front and center of everything they do. And the challenge for them was to combat the equation of negro equivale a pobre, black equals poor. This, according to them, was the whole basis of the problem they had to address, or the anti-racism had to address. And they did certain actions that could be seen as taking, you know, this is a kind of structural approach to racism and anti-racism. And one of the things they did was to issue employment certificates as a kind of certificate of inclusivity to certain companies that they judge to have a racially inclusive hiring policy and employment policies. They would issue these certificates to these businesses. They also arranged sort of youth-directed actions to try and keep youth off the streets, if you like. So they arranged parties and kind of X Factor style talent shows, which gave, they said the idea was to give young people something else to do, to divert their energies away from violence and street activity and drugs and so forth. But the key sort of message that was really behind this organization was a kind of middle-class entrism. That is to say that the way to challenge the negro equals pobre equation was to create a black middle class that was fashionable, or in the words of the founder of this organization, fashion, sexy, chic. So you create a black middle class that appeals to the middle class, that makes blackness a kind of consumer item, etc. So, one could say they were trying to address the negro equals pobre equation in a kind of structural way through their certification programs and so on. But there was a lack of a certain radical vision here, in the sense that they were really just trying to create a black middle class, and they weren't addressing the position of the vast majority of Afro-Colombians, which is not in the middle class. So you could criticize them for being not radical enough, but on the other hand, what they were doing was also very important in Colombia, where to get to be explicit about racism was also an important factor. Okay, next slide, thank you. But we were also interested in a large number of struggles that didn't foreground racism in that way. They didn't put it front and center of their agenda. And we coined the term of alternative grammars of anti-racism to talk about these more indirect and implicit discourses and strategies. For example, we found what I call a racially aware class consciousness. That is to say, there's a consciousness of social inequality which is somehow aware that race has got something to do with it, or that one's position as an indigenous or Afro-descendant person or a dark-skinned mestizo person is somehow connected to one's position in the class hierarchy. So we think that this is particularly relevant in mestizo societies, where whole centuries of race mixture and the discourse around race mixture has created societies where lots of people don't identify clearly as negro, afrodescendiente, Afro-Colombiano, or whatever, nor necessarily as white, but somehow sort of Moreno, or somewhere in the middle, mestizo, pardo, whatever. But at the same time, these are societies that are strongly stratified simultaneously by race and class. So you can't necessarily talk about class without talking about race, and vice versa. So this racially aware class consciousness was something that we were quite interested in. And there are other people have noted similar things for Brazil, or John Burdick and Keisha Khan Perry, for example, have noted very similar things in the places where they worked. And it's worth just sort of drawing a slight parallel with the collective, the artistic collective in Argentina called Identidad Marrón, who talk about their agenda of an anti-racismo con conciencia de clase, which is not quite the same thing as what we're talking about, because they're talking about a class consciousness which has an explicit anti-racist dimension to it, whereas we're talking about a class consciousness that has a kind of implicit racial dimension to it. Okay, so what are the strengths and risks of these alternative grammars of anti-racism? This is something we're going to come back to at the end. The strengths are that it addresses inherently the intersection between race and class, the way these two different dimensions interweave with each other. So you immediately have a strong structural focus, which is very useful to get away from the idea of racism as purely a matter of bad behavior or bad attitudes and so on. It's also inclusive. We found that in some cases, indigenous organizations didn't really want to use the language of racism and anti-racism because they saw race, the concept of race, as something that they'd sort of fought hard to get past and beyond. So they weren't that comfortable with bringing the language of racism back in as something that was central to their agenda. On the other hand, so it's inclusive. In that sense, it's inclusive. You can bring lots of different kinds of people into the struggle. On the other hand, racism doesn't just disappear. It's always there somewhere, even if it isn't explicitly put front and center. But the risks are equally that an alternative, this indirect alternative way of talking about anti-racism may underestimate the very integral role that racism and racialization play in reproducing inequality through processes of naturalization and dehumanization processes that we're all familiar with, or people who study racism are very familiar with. These are the kind of hallmarks, if you like, of racism, is to naturalize and inequality and dehumanize the people who are at the bottom of the scale. So we're going to look at 3 cases now from Brazil, Mexico, and Ecuador. We're going to look at how explicitly racism is named or not named, and how exactly racism features in the agendas of these struggles. We'll be looking at what kind of productive possibilities might be opened up by taking a more radical perspective on racism in each case. And we'll see how struggles for safety in the first case in Brazil, political power in the second case in Mexico, and land in the third case in Ecuador can all have anti-racist dimensions. Okay, I'll pass it back to Mónica now.
Thank you. So we're going to talk first about the Red de Comunidades en Movimientos contra Violencia and the alternative grammar of violence and security. This network is a Rio-based movement that started in about 2003 as a reaction to a series of 4 police massacres in the city's favelas. It had about 60 members, most of whom were at the time of the research favela-dwelling mothers and who self-identify as Black, as Negra. And of these, about 20 were quite active, which meant regularly attending meetings and activities like street protests and demonstrations, registering official complaints, attending court cases, etc. And there were also allies and supporters that were students, researchers, and other activists. The Rede denounces genocide and challenges mainstream drug war narratives, mass incarceration practices, and what we call lots of research we've been calling the criminalization of protest. They denounce racism in the justice system, drawing in data that looks at how the very big percentage of homicides of Black people in Brazil, and they were also kind of really trying to bring attention to how much Black people were 3 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police, taking into account all different kinds of demographics. So they were doing that kind of work. And when you look at their work, you would think, okay, how central is racism in their discourses and agenda? So what we saw is that the women in the network tended to identify as Black, that's a first, but this was rarely a matter of open discussion or affirmation. The mothers' protests against police violence frequently refer simply to the favelas and to young favela male dwellers as the victims, although they were not necessarily, the Blackness of the many murdered sons was not insistently made explicit by the mothers. It wasn't usually adduced alongside being a favelado and being poor. So it was usually, connected with living in the favelas, being poor as an intersectional whole. You also have calls were made for justice and against extermination by the state in a more broad sense. And racism, therefore, was not explicitly named in the network's banners, in their posters. These all recognize that police violence in favelas has an impact that crosses racial difference and indeed includes significant number of white victims. And they will all come together with these claim for justice and against state extermination, saying these, we are mothers were Black mothers, indigenous mothers, working mothers, poor mothers, slum mothers, peripheral mothers were warrior mothers, which was an important phrase, and they mobilized. Yet at the same time, the underlying racialized character of the killings and the protesters was ever present. And among the mothers, the discourse of lethal racism was easily and frequently deployed in diverse ways. So we can see that there was the use and they were able to put together data on violence, which in Brazil is collected according to age, sex, and color, opposing Blacks to whites rather than class. They would use the word genocide, which appear occasionally on the banners displayed in public demonstrations. They would use photos of victims, all young Black men, even if they have varied skin tone, and they all form part, central part of the visual aspect of these demonstrations. And they made the racialized character of the killing tacitly but abundantly clear, as did the bodies of the mother themselves. And this was a very interesting and strategic use of bodies and images to highlight the suffering and emotion and how the bodies were clearly racialized. In public speeches, mothers occasionally reiterated the racial bias of the violence and talk of favelas as Black territories. So in one interview, one mother said, and I read from the slide, "My children died at the hands of a racist police force because they were in racialized territory." Another one said, "Here in Brazil, you do not need to be guilty or involved in a crime to be killed. Just be Black, poor, and live in a favela to be in the sights of the police." Although a second later, she said only poor and from the favela. So this reinforces this absent present quality of racialized identifications. So racism, what we see in this case, comes into and out of focus, although we will see how it's more in focus or is in focus more often than in the next two cases that we're going to present, the one of the Congreso Nacional Indígena and WIMBY in Ecuador. And this implies then that there is an awareness of structural racism, but not necessarily a consistent strategic use of the explicit talk on race, racism, or anti-racism. There was also ambiguity about the intersection of race and class, an appreciation of the fact that they did not coincide completely, but they did overlap a lot, as we will also see in the next two cases. So I pass on to Pete now.
So the next case is Mexico, obviously, the Congreso Nacional Indígena, and this is an alternative grammar of political power. So the focus here is on the Consejo de Gobierno Indígena, which was something formed by the Congreso Nacional in 2017 to get an indigenous candidate onto the presidential slate. And they put forward this woman, Maria de Jesus Patricio, who's also known as Marichui, who is an indigenous healer and leader and so on. Next slide, please. So as people probably know, this is a Mexicanist seminar. The Congreso Nacional Indígena is a radical, very anti-capitalist organization. It has links and has its roots in the Zapatista rebellion in '94. And their discourse is explicitly about los de abajo, the ones from below. So if you look at their statements they make, etc., they say things like, we hear the pain of, escuchamos el dolor de todos los colores que somos el México de abajo. Todos los colores, no? And they say something like, it is not only the racism of the political structure that did not allow our proposal, that is to say Marichui's candidacy, to appear on the electoral ballots, because she didn't make it, she didn't get enough votes. Because if those who oppose capitalism's destruction of the world shared amongst them slanted blue and red eyes, i.e. were racially diverse, public policy and supposed democracy would be made to exclude them. So it doesn't matter what what color you are, what your racial identity is. If you're against capitalism, that's where the sort of struggle lies, is that political struggle. So, you know, in that sense, they're making only very occasional reference to racism. And indeed, if you look at across the range of their statements and so on, they only occasionally actually explicitly use that term. And they usually use it in a kind of line of other nouns like marginality, discrimination, genocide, etc., in which it figures as one amongst other problems. The word racismo, for example, appears only 9 times in 4 years of blog posts and news posts and so on their website. Nevertheless, there's a very strong sense of indigeneity specifically. There's constant reference to los pueblos indígenas. There's reference to autonomy based on the el espacio de los indios que somos. So there's always this constant reiteration of the idea of indigeneity, of being an Indio, and so on. So in that sense, there was clearly a very strong sense of racialized subalternity. But this was below the surface. So it wasn't necessarily always explicit, but it was certainly there. And that racialized dimension was made very obvious in the backlash against the candidacy of Marichui in social media, where, you know, there were only a few posts in social media, but they were very widely reported in the press. So it became a kind of a thing, if you like. And people made comments like, I would vote for Marichui. You can see she has experience in cleaning Mexico. So, you know, referring to as if she was a domestic servant. That Marichui looks like the woman who does the cleaning in my house. Esa Marichui se parece a la que limpia mi casa. Very explicit concatenation of race, class, and gender here in the figure of the domestic servant. That is so powerful in Latin America, and is such a powerful nexus for racial inequality in Latin America. So that was it made it very obvious that race and racism was part of the problem. So while on the one hand, the whole discourse of Los de Abajo kind of backgrounds that very evident racism, we also think that there was a very racially aware, and in this case, gendered class consciousness at work that although it didn't make it racism very central to what they were doing, it was certainly part of the story. So that allowed them, that racially aware class consciousness, without racism being the only story, allowed them to build coalitions and to try and reach out across beyond the boundaries of being an Indio, of being indigenous, to try and build links with Mestizos and with urban women, Mestizo and white women, etc., to build alliances. And also, one of the benefits of this was that it immediately implied a structural perspective on the racialized power structures of Mexico. So you couldn't look at what was going on without taking into account multiple forms of inequality. So this is a case of the uneven use of a discourse of racism, with racism, explicit reference to racism very much in the background, but with a very strong awareness of the structural dimensions of the interweavings of racism and classism. I'll pass it back to Mónica now.
Yeah, the last case we're going to talk about is the one of Wimby, an Afro-Ecuadorian community versus a palm oil multinational giant, the alternative grammar of environment and land. So Wimby is a community in the Pacific coastal region of Ecuador, ancestrally occupied by Black and some indigenous peoples. For centuries, but increasingly in the last few decades, the area has been subjected to exploitation by outside interests, mainly white, mestizo, national and international ones, for looking for natural resources like minerals and timber and agro-industrial production, palm oil plantations and shrimp farms. Members of local communities are often involved in these enterprises as workers in different modalities, but they might also be small entrepreneurs linked to the incoming businesses, and they may sell land or rights to resources or concede them in exchange to other benefits like road construction and the income of produce, etc. In this sort of a scenario, racism and anti-racism are not often mentioned explicitly by locals, by allies, or even by some social science analysts of the situation. And when interviewees mention the word, it's often in context of direct discrimination rather than structural processes. Yet there is some underlying awareness amongst locals of structural issues linked to their racialized condition, although in our interviews, it is mostly among a certain educated and activist group that this would happen. So we'll see comments like this by different kinds of people there. They do this to us because we're Black. It seems they want to eliminate us just because it's only with Black and Indigenous peoples that you can see such abuse of our rights. This was said by a local priest. The president of the district council said, the palm oil company says we have won against really important people. Are we going to lose to these negritos? It has been said that the state doesn't care about the lives of Black people in the area. In the class of poor people, where there are Blacks, whites, and mestizos, the most fucked up of all is the Black. There is a racial problem. I believe it's a racial struggle, not a class struggle. So the question of Blackness, and thus implicitly of racism, also arises in other ways. First, land, which can be claimed as ancestral land of an Afro-Ecuadorian community, even if this relates to multiculturalism, it still foregrounds a category for which racialized difference could be made evident. And indeed, this happened by some. Secondly, outsiders often portray the region as a whole as inferior, as underdeveloped, as uncivilized because of its Black and Indigenous population. So therefore, there is an underlying racialization linked to the historical geography and moral topography of the country, which creates and sustains, on the one hand, a structural link between underdevelopment and Blackness and indigeneity, and on the other hand, constructs an image of the region as a place open to exploitation by any means necessary in order to make a profit. Thus, the struggles for land and against environmental destruction are also implicitly anti-racist struggles, not just from our point of view as analysts making an argument about the operation of structural racism, but from the point of view of some of the local people as well. So what are the implications of this use of race and racism? As in the previous cases, we want to think about this question. So on the one hand, pursuing land and well-being as a local or regional group may be productive in gaining ground in a material sense. In a context of mestizaje or in other contexts of the post-racial denial and the legitimation of racism, it can be an effective tactic for maximizing the legitimacy of claims and struggles in the eyes of others. So for example, it may avoid the threat of the legitimation that a more clearly racial demand may attract. On the other hand, it leaves implicit a key factor in the suite of mechanisms that reproduce disadvantage and block struggle. So like the REDE and the Consejo Indígena de Gobierno, racism came into and out of focus, although in this case, it was rather less in focus than in the other two cases. There was an ambiguity as well, like the other two, about the intersection of race and class, an appreciation of the fact that they didn't coincide completely, but they did overlap. For Wimby, we see a lesser awareness of structural racism alongside a good deal of clarity about the unequal exploitation of land and environmental consequences, a clarity that is nevertheless tinged with a sense that the racialized position of the area's inhabitants is somehow involved in this inequality. So, I mean, this refers to what Pete was explaining as this racially aware class consciousness that we see developing. Notably in this case, as in the Consejo Nacional Indígena, is that when racism is adduced in this context, it leads directly to a structural analysis of the topic, going beyond individual discriminations and stigmatizations. As with the Consejo Nacional Indígena, it invites and even obliges to consider the whole racialized power structure of Ecuador.
So to conclude then, as we started out by saying, there has been in Latin America a recent focus on racism. It's been more of part of the public debate in the newspapers, in state discourse, in social movement discourse and so on. It's becoming more talked about. And very often this is seen as useful. It's seen as a first step. It's something that especially Black social movements, but also in some indigenous social movements, fight for. You have to, get onto the table the fact that there's a problem with racism in Latin America, given the widespread and long-standing denials or minimizations of racism that Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, etc., especially are notorious for. So you can see that focus on racism as being a useful step. But it can also lead to some pretty limited outcomes. So, for example, lots of legislation that has been introduced, anti-racist legislation, top down from the state and so on, but maybe informed by conversations with social movements, has been fairly limited in its impact. So often the bar is high in terms of the level of proof required to actually convict somebody of racial hate crime or of being racist or something, means that very few people actually get, very few cases are brought, and very few of those cases are actually successful and so forth. So it can lead to this limited and sometimes rather superficial outcome to focus on racism itself. On the other hand, we can also address these kind of race-class intersections, which immediately gives us a much more structural perspective and invites us to look at these racialized systems of class inequality and bringing gender into the picture as well. So these alternative grammars do, the advantage of them is they address the basic structures of inequality and are also racially aware. And I think that this provides a kind of foothold for anti-racism in a Mestizo society. So it's one way in which, in a Mestizo society where there may be some reluctance or ambivalence about talking about race and racism in the first place, one way you can get a foothold or get a kind of your foot in the door is to talk about inequality in general without necessarily always talking primarily about race as being the most important dimension of that inequality. Now, some people might say that, okay, that's just pandering to mestizo or white fragility, not wanting to sort of stir up, confront, be confrontational and to challenge people about their privilege and so forth. We don't think that that's necessarily the case, because we're not, these discourses are not denying race, they're not minimizing race, they're just, it's always there, it's always present, but it's not necessarily the only and most important factor in the struggle.
Okay. So, however, there are risks here of underestimating the importance of the integral role racism and racialized inequality play in structuring hierarchy and inequality as a whole. So we see that WIMBY locals are unevenly aware of the historical intersections of race and class via colonialism, which have over the centuries produced the durable and often inflexible layers and accumulations that constitute today's social structures. Even the people of the Consejo Nacional Indígena, who often deploy a discourse that is explicitly aware of these things, often also put them in a Marxist frame that reduces racism to an ideological tool at the service of capitalism, rather than seeing it as historically constitutive of capitalism and liberal political orders. So, but what we see is, like, for example, as well, the racist and sexist reaction to Marichui's electoral campaign suggests that it might be necessary at some point to talk more explicitly about racism alongside sexism, as it's not only used as means of attacking indigenous organizing, but is also a key element in the mechanisms that reproduce inequality more widely in Mexico. So what we argue then in this paper is that it is worth exploiting this current turn to anti-racism in Latin America and working with a politically radical horizon in view, but also to highlight just how much racism has been and still is integral to the fabric of the class system. That is to highlight racialized dimensions of inequality and of struggles and the systematic character of racialized disadvantage, as well as the possibilities racism offers for processes of naturalization and dehumanization, as Pete suggested before. So this, we argue, is a worthwhile goal in itself. And in working in this way, moreover, other effects might be entailed. Alternative grammars also open way to, for example, Black Indigenous alliances. Emphasizing racism is often seen as divisive and causing separations between Black people, who tend to more easily think in terms of racism, and Indigenous people, who tend often to avoid the concept. But grasping racism in its structural dimensions and its intersections with class can provide a common platform on which to mobilize, be it around land, resources, power, security, well-being, etc. Another effect that alternative grammars open to is to consider mestizos as allies. The same approach can also give mestizos a way of seeing how they are implicated in the system as people who are also oppressed by the intersections of race and class, even if they are not Indigenous or Black, but also simultaneously as people who might sometimes benefit from and sometimes reproduce these intersections. Our argument in favor of the alternative grammars of anti-racism doesn't preclude the worthiness of naming racism. Talk in terms of racism and racial disadvantage as structural issues, not just individual acts of stigmatization or discrimination, can help wider claims for social justice and change. The current turn to anti-racism and seeking this precision of naming racism as a structural issue, we think can be useful to highlight these less visible racialized and intersectional dimensions of inequality and of social struggles. And these would, you can see it can help us highlight systemic intersections of racial, gender, and class inequality and disadvantage, and can certainly push forward a radical agenda of social transformation. Thank you very much. We stop there.
Yeah, thank you for your attention.
So
Thank you both, Mónica and Peter, for this very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure a lot of you have questions. So now we open the floor for anyone who wanna make any comment or want to ask any question. Please raise your hand so we can call your name. Here's a question actually on the chat box by Miguel Garcia. And he's wondering if during your research, you find examples in which these movements considered employing cultural products like film, music, or graphic art to promote their concerns, reach wider audiences, and perhaps tackle issues like racism, classism, and discrimination.
Pete, do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we didn't in this project, we didn't focus specifically on movements that were using artistic practice and creative practice and so on to combat racism. I mean, you know, I guess the closest we got to it was a number of groups of women who, Black women who were organizing around hair and beauty and hairstyles, some of which involved kind of using hair in a creative way, making these very elaborate hairstyles and you know, little microempresas to market products that were designed for African style hair and so on. So that was the closest we got in this project. I mean, I'm currently doing a project which is called Cultures of Anti-Racism in Latin America, that is focusing precisely on artists and creative practitioners and how they use their work to talk about racism and challenge racism and so on. But that's another story.
I can also open the floor while other people organize their thoughts to ask questions. I thought this was a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and especially the part about, for me, the part about the fact that you won't necessarily find race talk even in places where you would expect it, right? In places where there's apparently some racial inequality, where race seems to be functioning as a significant social boundary. Some people do not necessarily use that category, right, to make sense of the situation. So my question to you is, across the board, do you think this reflects a supply or a demand issue? Do you think it's really about individuals involved in these situations that they just don't see necessarily race as a main lens through which to understand a certain situation? Or do you think it's because they anticipate that if they use that specific lens, if they do race talk, if they use race as a tool, it won't resonate with the majority of population. It won't resonate with the national governments, precisely because of all these national ideologies that minimize the role of race.
Well, I can say something and then you, Pete. Well, what I think is that there is a wide range of possibilities, and that's what we found. That is not just one thing, but I mean, the background for all of these reticence or tiptoeing and different uses of race and racism has to do with mestizaje and how successful it has been in sort of mobilizing this march against a clear use and understanding, and a clear understanding of the formation of race and racism. So I think that's one thing that affects throughout the continent. But then you have a specific cases where some people are very clear that racism is really only makes sense to them when it's direct discrimination or direct violence. So indigenous people, like we had a case in Ecuador, in Saraguro, where they will talk about racism because they were attacked, and they say the attack is because we are indigenous, and the very racialized kind of violent attacks, and that's when racism for them became clear. And other places like in Buenaventura, which we didn't talk about these cases, but Buenaventura, there was a paro cívico in Colombia, and people were more clear. They didn't want to antagonize the government by making the claim on racism because they could think this could be used against us, or it could be minimize our more broader struggle, which is about our living conditions and a broader situation. So I think there are different, it wouldn't be like a one thing or the other, and in the Mexican case, it's quite interesting because you would think that's where, well, we can say, mestizaje has been very, very successful in deflating, the power of using race and racism. So it's a loss in some ways, but it is kind of coming back. I mean, there is a whole movement at the minute, if you call it movement, or yeah, in between fashion and movement of like using and talking about race and anti-racism. So I think it will be depending and moving. Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to say if it's a supply or demand, because these things are, they're kind of mutually constitutive. So there is where there is reluctance to talk about race, it can be because, as in the case of Buenaventura, people or leaders in this case were aware that if you use the explicit discourse of race, that might cause certain kinds of have certain repercussions in terms of your relationship to the state, rather than it just being a sort of reluctance on your own part to use that discourse because you're not comfortable with it yourself. And other people, actually want to use the discourse in a very explicit way in order to make people uncomfortable, in order to, challenge them. And so Chao Racismo was very much about that, pushing forward the whole notion of racism, but at the same time making it kind of acceptable. So you saw that little photo there of on the slide that we showed of beauty queens, white, very light-skinned mestizo beauty queens holding the Chao Racismo t-shirt. So the idea was, you sell the idea of racism to these sort of middle-class, good-looking, white-looking people, and make them, sort of smile and accept the idea that racism or anti-racism can be something that they would want to sign up to. So yeah, like Monica says, there's lots of different reactions, and yeah, it's partly a question of people looking at people. It's a kind of hall of mirrors thing of looking at other people and seeing how they're going to react if they, if you behave in a certain way. So yeah, it's a question of strategies in the end.
Thank you for that answer. And there's another question on the chat box, and it says, what could be an example of this new grammar that names racism in cases where it is not directly recognized? How to change the discourse, not only in the cases of social movements, but also in terms of public policy. So there's a public policy question here.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, if you look at Brazil is an example where there has been huge shift in public policy that started in the mid-90s with explicit recognition by the state that racism was an issue or racial inequality was an issue, and a whole raft of legislative reforms around affirmative action that people are probably familiar with, university admissions and federal employment and so on, very controversial. So, that was a case. I mean, Brazil is always a bit of an exception because, there's always been a vocal minority amongst the Black movement, from the 1920s onwards or 1910s, in, calling out racism, calling out racial prejudice, at least it was the terminology used at that time. So, gradually that's, and at the same time, there's a long tradition in Brazil of minimizing it and, talking it, not only minimizing it, but calling it class, which is not the same as what we're talking about, which is a racially aware class consciousness. The strategy in Brazil from the top was to say, no, it's not about race, it's only about class. And because it's about class, therefore, it's not about race. So, the Black movement in Brazil has always struggled against that and has, called out racism and tried to make racism much more central. And it's, it's succeeded in the sense of making racism a feature in public policy, but at the cost of a huge kind of controversy about it. And, which eventually sort of made the whole thing about individuals, is this person Black enough to warrant a university place? Is this person Black enough to warrant, this particular job in the federal employment, etc.? And that's made it, it's been counterproductive in a way, because then you get these commissions that are sitting there deciding whether someone is Black enough to deserve, the benefits of this affirmative action program, which isn't really the way you want to go. So you want something broader and more sort of structural, or having broader structural dimensions. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but some thoughts there anyway.
And I would like to add something about Mexico for that question, where I think this idea of the grammars can be used as well to see and in another direction how, for example, racism in Mexico is really not talked about as racism, and is used more the term discrimination, which seems to be, everybody seems to be much more comfortable. And some people refer to racial discrimination, and what we see in the government in terms of public policy is that because discrimination is a legal term that can be used, then suddenly what you see is a change, almost like an appropriation of what racism could be, and moving it into this more narrow understanding of discrimination. So this structural perspective is lost a lot of the time, and we end up with this constant reiteration that racism is about, well, it's discrimination, and it's about attitudes, and it's about personal issues, about access or no access to particular spaces and resources, but without acknowledging wider processes. And this, of course, we don't want to dismiss that could be useful, but there is a danger on that use, if we think particularly of these grammars there, of how it might not be an alternative grammar actually, in that case. I don't know if
Thank you,
that's
Mónica.
well, yeah.
And we have time for one last question. Aida, you have your hand raised if you want to go for it.
Yes, thank you. I think this is also similar to the public policy question, but I wonder if in the time that you researched these grammars, you saw any movement into like education policy across countries. Like, I think about so much of what you said parallels with the racial struggles here in the United States, right? The erasure of race as an issue. And today we're still fighting back against that struggle. And I think about movement building even in this country and how so much of our progress as a people organized movement has come from community-led education practices that have tackled race and have put the racial question at the forefront. And even today, right here, we're fighting for critical race studies in our grade schools and experiencing severe pushback because we're still trying to, as a country and as a racialized society, trying to center race as a form of oppression. And so I wonder too, whether in your studies about these movements, people are, of course, my familiarity is like indigenous communities in Mexico do have their own education structures, and whether that's spreading to a public policy sphere where we could see a shift over time in Mexico, in Brazil, and Argentina, teaching race studies and the sociology of racialization in grade schools, which doesn't happen, right? I attended grade school in Mexico for a few years, and the curriculum is definitely focused on mestizaje. So do you think that at the movement level, there's shift towards policy and education?
Well, Mónica probably knows more about Mexico in this sense than I do. I mean, I think, yeah, it is part of the agenda of many different social movements, is this educational dimension. And, as usual, it's a kind of battleground. So in Colombia, ethno-education has long been part of what the state has been comfortable with adopting at some level. So it has been, I think, pretty willing to give a bit of ground on that front, at least superficially. So when you begin to look at what it actually means to give ground, in terms of institutionalizing ethno-education, then it tends to be more a question of teaching about Black history or teaching about indigenous history, rather than teaching about racial inequality and racism as a system. And even the teaching of Black history and indigenous history and culture and so on, can become very superficial. And in Brazil, you find the same thing as you find in the UK around this sort of, multicultural education policies, which is that often, it's the only Black teacher, if you like, in the school who ends up being lumbered with the whole work of, taking the multicultural education program forward in a given school, and given very limited resources and not allowed enough time to do it, which then counts against their career progression and all kinds of things. So it becomes this kind of battleground between these rather superficial and conditional responses on the part of the state and the more radical initiatives led from the social movements and so on. But yeah, maybe Mónica has some more to say about Mexico.
Yeah, well, I would just say that I guess we're not claiming that there is just a simple erasure of race, but actually that if we look at what empirically the organizations are doing in this case, what they are calling us to think about also wider issues and wider struggles that incorporate racialized, that they have racialized effects, that they have racialized in disadvantaged people organized, participating in it. So I would just be kind of careful of looking at this also as a possibility of broaden it up, anti-racist struggle, to maybe anti-oppression struggle, or how the CNA talks about it like a struggle for life. So they are also inviting us to think about more broader about this. What we kind of coming and say is that maybe if you add to that some clarity or precision about what race is or what anti-racism does, or bring it to it, it could bring more sharp focus, it could strengthen the struggle. But we don't think necessarily that that struggle is bad or wrong or negative, or erasing race with with advantage, or with that in mind as an objective. That's kind of, I hope I'm clear with this. And yeah, very more broadly, I mean, the education dimension is still something we know that education is not the solution. I mean, for years, we know that education is not necessarily the way that things get resolved. We might know things, but it doesn't mean we're going to act on them. However, getting clear about things and discussing them and having learning processes that are, a bit more, maybe more complex and much more grounded is always welcome. So I think there's a big debate opening now about what education, what sort of anti-racist education could mean. If you think formally, yes, schools, universities don't even touch race in Mexico. They're opening some seminars, there are some things, but it's not necessarily integrated in the curriculum. And I can foresee that that's going to take a while, if at all will happen. But that doesn't preclude many other anti-racist organizations to keep trying to do this work of clarifying, mobilizing the terminology, helping people to be clear and to take on, a perspective. Similarly, that we had a gender perspective incorporated in public policy and in many programs, and now gender is not a problem that causes problem in the streets or in the classrooms or in the government offices. Maybe the similar thing will happen with race. I mean, it could be.
Thank you, and we're unfortunately out of time. But I did have one last question for you, and this is about the future, right? In the sense that I wonder if you focused in those different countries, you focused on specific areas of struggle, right? You focus on indigenous groups, in Afro-descendant groups. But I wonder, can your findings tell us something about larger trends, about where the mainstream is going, about the middle classes, can you tell us something about the role of race in this larger public discourse? I'm thinking about the case of Mexico, particularly where you find that Congreso Nacional Indígena talk with race with trepidation, right? They were very hesitant to talk about race, but nonetheless, what you see in Mexican society within the last 10 years, particularly as a result of a lot of social science scholarship, right? That essentially the finding was that skin color matters, right? That Mexicans with darker skin, they have lower life chances than Mexicans with lighter skin, even when you take into account their class background and so forth. There seems to be a change, in public discourse in Mexico, where I see a lot more middle classes talking about race. There's even certain on Twitter, certain memes, that the fact that people now talk about whitexicans, that vocabulary of race, of physical difference, was not present 10 years ago. So is there a little bit of a tension there where you see these indigenous groups still hesitant to talk about race, while the middle classes seem to be there's some kind of a change in discourse where they're more and more comfortable discussing physical differences, of course in a shallow way, but nonetheless it's there?
Well, yes, what we see is, a growing trend in fashion and, taken over in the media, in the social media, in the popular discourse, particularly after Perla's success. And we also analyzed the encuesta, de movilidad.
Módulo de movilidad social, ¿no? Intergeneracional.
Yeah. where they used, they made a comparative between use skin color using as a base perlas and skin palette.
Paleta de colores.
Using now they use other things as well, colorimetro and other technologies, but basically it's using that to demonstrate, that social mobility is totally marked by color, by skin color. So the discussion on skin color has been very, very debated, very hot potato. People are like all over. And this is what we see now is a whole movement called Poder Prieto, for example, that talking about dark skin mestizo people and trying to have a language around race that is like letting them sort of, express how racism has been for this group, which is the majority of the population. I mean, what I see here is, of course, a risk. There are always risks. I mean, it's great that this is happening. It's great that it's going to be it's an interesting thing where mestizaje is being sort of taken in a different direction and it's being popularized. But of course, it is also done in a very, almost very similar to Chao Racismo in a way. It's trying to be entrepreneurial. It's trying to kind of bring up, having a middle class and upper class that is darker skin. People are saying, we want the jobs, we want to access, we want to be on TV, we want that. There is not necessarily what the Zapatistas are doing or the Consejo Indígena, which is like, this is a capitalist system that is putting us all in risk. It's not a struggle for life. So it's very, very different kind of anti-racism. So it is very good, it's there, but what you have is like, even Cerveza, Bohemia, no, Corona, I don't even know which one, but one of those beer campaigns completely trivializing skin color. Now they're doing a campaign about indigenous languages. It's like there's an opportunity here for using this boom of anti-racism. That's why I think it's quite interesting we talk about this turn to anti-racism, because there is everywhere, there are all these trials. And what we wanted to offer with the project and the book, which is lovely, and I recommend you to look at, is that we try to map out how are all these different kinds and strategies of anti-racism emerging, and what are they doing to the bigger project of having a vision of social transformation that in a way doesn't leave anybody behind. And I don't necessarily think that this is exactly what's happening, but it's very good it's happening. It's like, so we're in that thing. We don't want to say it's crap, but we also want to say we need to be cautious of what kind of vision and what kind of vision is behind this anti-racist move, let's say. I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely. A very nuanced and complex discussion, very thought-provoking discussion. We want to thank you both, Mónica and Peter, for sharing your wonderful work. We look forward to seeing your book in print. You say it's going to be, it will come out.
It's ready.
It's already ready. It's already out.
Yeah,
Great.
It came out in March couple of weeks ago.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we can't wait to actually read it. But this is really, it's been a great discussion. I want to thank you both. And also want to thank everybody for coming to Katz Center for Mexican Studies. And we'll see you very soon.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming up, and thanks for your questions.
I love your background, Peter. Is that